It was the kind of night that makes you feel small. The rain fell steadily, pattering against the windows, while the distant rumble of thunder rolled across the empty hills. I remember sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the cold outside. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the rain, a sound I'd always found comforting. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the more I tried to shake it, the heavier the feeling grew, like the weight of unseen eyes on the back of my neck. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Also, leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Now back to my story. And then, through the steady rhythm of the storm, I heard it. A sound so faint it could have been the wind. Or so I thought at first. It was a scream, distant but unmistakable, cutting through the rain like a blade. I froze, listening, waiting for it to come again. Was it just my imagination? Or had something, or someone, broken the stillness of that quiet autumn night? Whatever it was, that single sound marked the beginning of something I could never forget. What happened next would change everything. Tonight, I want to take you back to a story that has haunted me for years. A story that refuses to let go no matter how hard I try to forget. It's not the kind of tale you'll find in a book or on a website. It's real enough that even now, as I sit here recounting it, I can still feel the chill of that night like it just happened. This is not a story for the faint of heart, but it is one that deserves to be told. It began in a small, secluded house deep in the woods. A place so remote, you could drive for hours without passing another car. The house sat at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in the moment the sun went down. In the fall, the leaves would turn brilliant shades of red and orange, but by late October, the branches stood bare, like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. It was here, in this lonely corner of the world, that something happened. The house itself was old, centuries old. Locals whispered about its history, about the strange occurrences that had plagued it for generations. But most dismissed the stories as nothing more than small-town folklore. After all, houses creak, storms come and go, and the mind can play tricks in the dark. Still, there was something different about this place. The air felt heavier there, like it carried the weight of everything that had ever happened within those walls. And then there was the rain. It never seemed to stop, a constant, unrelenting downpour that masked every sound, except for the ones you didn't want to hear. What happened on one particular rainy night in late October has left a scar on anyone who has dared to hear the tale. Some say the events were so horrifying. The house itself seems to breathe, alive with memories it refuses to let fade. Others claim the truth is even darker. All I know is that after that night, no one ever looked at the house the same way again. And after you hear this story, neither will you. Tonight, we're not just revisiting the events of that night. We're stepping into them. You'll feel the rain, hear the whispers, and walk the halls of that house as if you were there yourself. But be warned, this is not a story with a tidy ending. It doesn't leave you with answers, only questions. Questions that will stay with you long after the rain stops. It all started with an innocent weekend getaway. At least, that's what I told myself when we decided to head out there. A friend had recommended the cabin, tucked away in the woods, far from the noise of the city. I was looking forward to the peace, to the quiet I so desperately needed. My partner, Sarah, was eager as well. She loved the idea of being away from everything, disconnected, just the two of us surrounded by nature. Little did we know, the very isolation we craved would soon turn into our greatest nightmare. The drive up was long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into the gray mist. The rain had started lightly at first, a soft drizzle against the windshield. But as we ascended, the weather worsened, the rain growing heavier, as though the storm was following us. By the time we reached the cabin, the trees loomed above us, their branches thick and heavy with rain, like dark, silent sentinels. The forest surrounding the cabin was unnervingly still, except for the constant rhythm of rain hitting the leaves and the occasional distant rustling, as if something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. We parked the car by the cabin, a modest wooden structure surrounded by a thick line of trees. The moment we stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of the place settle over me. It was too quiet, unnaturally quiet. The air felt damp and heavy, pressing in on me. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just the weather, that it was nothing to worry about. But something didn't feel right. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to be in her element. She loved the rustic charm of the cabin, with its creaky porch and old windows, the kind that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. She grabbed the key from the small wooden box near the door and unlocked it, the sound of the latch echoing in the silence. We stepped inside, the smell of old wood and dust filling the air. The place was charming in its own way. Furniture covered with sheets, an old fireplace in the corner, and a large window that looked out into the dark expanse of trees. I felt a slight shiver as I crossed the threshold, but I chalked it up to the dampness outside. Sarah was already unloading our bags, excitedly discussing what she wanted to do first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked through the cabin, the sound unusually loud in the stillness. It wasn't until we sat down to unpack that I noticed something strange. On the small wooden table in the center of the living room was a handwritten note, folded neatly in half. At first, I thought it was a message left by the previous renters, something casual or welcoming. But when I unfolded the paper, my stomach dropped. The note read, "Don't go outside after dark. It's safer if you stay inside. Trust me, you'll hear them before you see them." The handwriting was scrawled, rushed, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. My eyes lingered on the words for far too long. I looked up at Sarah, who was now flipping through a guidebook about the area, oblivious to the unease that had settled in my chest. She shrugged when I showed it to her. "Probably just a joke from the last people who stayed here," she said with a smile, brushing it off as if it were nothing more than a quirky note meant to add character to the cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a joke. There was something about the urgency in those words that made my skin crawl. I pushed the note aside, telling myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't stop looking out the window at the dense forest beyond. It felt as though the trees themselves were watching us, their branches shifting in the wind like fingers reaching out. We decided to unpack and make ourselves comfortable, trying to ignore the strange weight of the note that hung in the air. As night began to fall, I couldn't help but feel the tension building. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling through the trees, the rain now beating against the windows as if trying to get in. We had a fire going in the hearth, the warmth of it a stark contrast to the growing chill in the air. Yet, despite the heat from the flames, I couldn't shake the coldness creeping over me. I tried to push it aside, telling myself it was just the weather playing tricks on my mind. But then it happened. We were sitting by the fire when I heard it, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the crackling of the fire mixing with the sound of the wind outside. But as I focused, I realized the sound was closer, much closer. It was the unmistakable sound of wet footsteps, the kind you hear when someone walks across the damp forest floor. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah looked at me, confused. "What is it? Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low, my mind racing. She listened for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "It's just the rain," she said, but her voice faltered slightly. Even she could hear it now, the distinct sound of someone or something walking outside. I moved to the window, trying to peer through the curtains, but the darkness beyond was impenetrable. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then, as if they had been waiting for me to look away, they started again, this time closer, much closer. The rain was so loud, I could hardly hear anything else. But I swear, I heard it then, someone breathing right outside the window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring into the blackness, my mind racing. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I exhaled, not realizing I had been holding my breath. My heart still thudded painfully in my chest. I turned to Sarah, who had her eyes fixed on me, her face pale. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky. "But I think we should lock the door tonight." The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, heavier now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I could still hear the rain beating against the windows, but the storm outside seemed quieter now, muffled by the increasing silence that filled the house. Whatever was out there, I had the strange feeling it wasn't just the wind. As the night wore on, the storm outside seemed to grow in intensity, the wind howling louder, as if it, too, were trying to warn us. Inside the cabin, the fire continued to crackle, but the warmth it provided couldn't seem to shake the cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made me jump. Sarah seemed just as uneasy, though she tried to laugh it off. But I could see it in her eyes. She was starting to feel it too. It started small at first, lights flickering, the kind of thing that makes you second-guess your senses. At first, I thought it was just the storm messing with the power, but the lights flickered again, then a third time. Each time, the room grew a little darker, until only the firelight remained, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. I tried to ignore it, but something about the way the lights dimmed felt deliberate. Then came the doors. It started with the kitchen door, which we had closed tightly before sitting down for the night. I don't know how long we had been talking, but at some point, I heard it, a soft creak. It wasn't the wind, not this time. It was the door, slowly inching open. I froze. I had locked that door myself. I looked at Sarah, but she was already staring at the door with wide eyes. Neither of us had moved. I stood up, heart racing, and walked over to the door. As I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the cabin. I jumped back, a rush of cold air flooding the room. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I stood there, paralyzed with fear. I glanced nervously around the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but something was wrong. We couldn't explain it, but everything was starting to feel wrong. The air itself felt heavier, thicker, as though it was pressing in on us. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire and the relentless pounding of the rain. The storm outside was now at its peak, a deafening roar against the roof. Yet the cabin felt more isolated than ever. The house seemed to be swallowing us whole. It was around then that we found the journal. I was searching through the old wooden shelves near the fireplace when I came across a thick, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, the pages yellowed with age. My fingers trembled as I opened it, and the first thing I noticed was the handwriting. Neat, but hurried, as though someone had written these words with a sense of urgency. At first, the entries were simple. Descriptions of the weather, the isolation, the beauty of the surrounding forest. But then, as I read on, the entries grew darker. The author began to describe strange happenings, things moving on their own, whispers in the night, and feelings of being watched. The last entry was the most chilling. They came again last night. It was the same as before. The footsteps outside, the cries in the woods. I'm not sure how much longer I can stay here. They're always watching. I hear them even now, breathing just beyond the door. If you're reading this, please leave. Don't make the same mistake I did. I looked up at Sarah, who was reading over my shoulder. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. This can't be real, she whispered, her voice shaky. It's just some sick joke. Maybe the previous people left it behind as some kind of weird prank. But even as she spoke, I could feel it, an undeniable weight pressing down on us, a presence in the room that hadn't been there before. Something was watching us. I could feel its gaze on the back of my neck, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackling fire and the rain that had begun to pound the roof with a vicious intensity. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a faint sound from outside. A cry, soft but unmistakable. It sent a cold shiver down my spine. It wasn't the wind, not the rain. It was someone crying. I rushed to the window, heart hammering in my chest, and looked out. The rain blurred my vision, but just beyond the tree-line, I saw something or someone. A figure standing motionless in the downpour. I strained my eyes, trying to make out more details, but as I blinked, the figure was gone. I stepped back from the window, breathing heavily, my mind reeling. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah didn't answer. She was staring at the door. It was then that we heard the footsteps again, closer this time, moving steadily, as though someone was walking right up to the cabin. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. The rain had picked up so violently, I could barely make out anything beyond the threshold. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my ears. The air was thick, the rain falling in torrents, and the wind had started to howl. But as I stood there, drenched and shivering, I felt it again, a presence just out of sight. And then I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible, faint crying, not from the trees, not from the wind, but from the darkness just beyond the cabin. The sound was muffled, like it was coming from under the earth itself. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing there, no one. The cries continued, growing louder, more desperate. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab Sarah and leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Some part of me was terrified, yes, but another part of me needed to know, needed to understand what was happening here. I stepped back inside, the door slamming shut behind me. I locked it, my hands shaking. Sarah was standing in the corner now, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my voice tight with anxiety. "But we're not alone here." The sound of crying was still faint, but now it was joined by another sound, soft whispers, just on the edge of hearing. They were coming from somewhere close by, but I couldn't tell where. I glanced over at the journal again, and that's when I saw it. A new entry, written in a different hand, a hand that looked more recent than the others. "They can hear you. They know you're there. Don't let them in. They'll never let you leave." I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. We weren't safe. Not anymore. And we had to get out before it was too late. What would you do if you were trapped in a cabin, with no way to reach the outside world, no phone signal, no one to call for help, and someone lurking in the shadows? How far would you go to escape, to survive? For us, that was no longer just a question. It was a reality. The cabin, once a simple getaway, had become a prison. And worse, we weren't alone. I glanced at Sarah, who was still staring at the journal, her hand trembling as she turned the pages. The entries weren't just stories anymore. They were accounts, live updates unfolding in real time. Each word mirrored what we were experiencing. We had seen the figure standing at the tree line. We had heard the footsteps, And now the journal was telling us things that hadn't happened yet. They will come for you in the storm peaks. The whispers will become voices, and the walls will close in. Do not trust the shadows. Do not open the door. Sarah read the last entry out loud, her voice barely above a whisper. It's happening. Right now, she said, her eyes wide with terror. It's like they knew what would happen, like someone is watching us. Before I could respond, the room grew suddenly colder. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I instinctively looked over my shoulder. Nothing. But then, the first window shattered. Loud, violent, as if something had struck it with force. The glass rained down onto the floor in a cascade of sharp shards. My heart skipped a beat. We weren't alone. Something was inside. Did you see that? Sarah whispered, her face drained of color. She wasn't looking at the window anymore. She was looking at the door. I followed her gaze, and my blood ran cold. The door, the very door we had locked not minutes ago, was slowly creaking open. The sound was deafening in the silence of the room, echoing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I rushed to the door, slamming it shut, and turned the lock, but it felt wrong. The lock didn't click properly, as if something on the other side was keeping it from securing. And then the power went out. The light, the warmth of the fire, the comfort of knowing we weren't completely isolated. Everything was gone in an instant. The room was plunged into complete darkness. I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but before I could find it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It was a sound I'll never forget. Every nerve in my body screamed for us to run. But where? We were trapped. There was nowhere to go. The storm outside raged on, and the cries from the woods had become louder, more desperate. The whispers had escalated, filling the cabin with a static hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I grabbed Sarah by the arm and pulled her toward the bedroom. We had to barricade ourselves in, at least for a while, until we could figure out what was happening. We hurried down the narrow hallway, our footsteps echoing in the silence that had overtaken the house. Every door we passed seemed to creak and groan, as if the house itself were alive, watching us. Once inside the bedroom, we slammed the door shut and shoved the old dresser against it. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears as we both sank to the floor. My breath was ragged, and I couldn't stop shaking. There was no denying it anymore. We were being hunted. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe we were safe. We were behind a door, barricaded in a room, and the house seemed quiet again. But that peace was short-lived. It started with a soft thud, almost too quiet to hear. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another thud, closer this time. Then a slow, deliberate pace of footsteps, growing nearer, step by step, until they were just outside the door. I dared not breathe, not even a whisper. The footsteps stopped. The door creaked. I thought for a moment it was Sarah, but she was frozen, wide-eyed beside me, her hands clasped tightly together. The door handle began to turn, slowly, cautiously, as if whoever was on the other side was savoring the moment. The sound of it scraping against the frame sent a shiver through my entire body. The darkness in the room seemed to close in on me, suffocating me, as though the very air had become heavy with dread. I reached out and gripped Sarah's hand tightly, my own fear now outweighing my need for logic. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She nodded, her eyes wide, her face pale, but I could see that she too had heard it. Whispers, just faint enough to be indistinguishable, yet unmistakable. They were coming from behind the door. The footsteps started again, retreating this time, but not far. I dared not open the door to check. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was playing a game with us. We sat there in the pitch-black room, holding our breath, waiting. The rain outside grew louder, as if it were trying to drown out the sounds from within. But the whispers, they were still there, almost close enough to hear clearly. One word echoed above the rest: leave. And just as quickly as they had come, the footsteps stopped. The whispers faded into nothingness. The tension in the room, though, remained. Sarah and I were frozen in place, too terrified to speak, but both of us knew something was coming. The door would not hold for long, and when it opened again, would we survive the night? Would you have stayed? Would you have tried to escape? Or would you have hidden, praying for the storm to end? What would you have done if you knew that whatever was out there was already inside? The silence was unbearable. It wrapped itself around us, smothering every breath, every thought. My heart was pounding so loudly that it almost drowned out the distant echoes of the storm outside. But something had changed. The air felt thick, charged, as if the very house itself were holding its breath, waiting. Then I saw it. Through the fogged-up window, a figure appeared. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, but as the rain poured down, the form became clearer, more distinct. A ghostly apparition, drenched to the bone, its clothes clinging to its pale, almost translucent skin. Its face, it was hard to make out, but the hollow, vacant eyes seemed to be staring directly at me, staring into me. And then it moved, not like a person moves. No, it floated, its feet barely skimming the ground as it drifted closer to the window. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stared in frozen terror as it pressed its face against the glass. The figure was impossibly outside the window. We were on the second floor. There was no way, no logical way, that anyone could have been there standing, looking in at us. But there it was, as if gravity itself had bent to its will. The rain soaked its form, but it didn't seem to care. It just stood there, unblinking, unyielding. Its mouth moved, but no sound came. Sarah gasped beside me, and I forced myself to look away from the window. We had to get out. Sarah, I whispered, my voice hoarse, we need to run. We can't stay here. Not anymore. We both rose to our feet, shaking. The urgency in my chest grew as I hurried to the door, but just as my hand touched the handle, something held it in place. I tugged, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if some invisible force had latched onto it, refusing to let us go. Do you feel that? Sarah asked in a trembling voice, her eyes wide with terror. I nodded. The room had grown colder, much colder. The wind outside had begun to howl, but it was no longer the wind that chilled us. It was something else, something unnatural that seemed to seethe beneath the very walls, pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the house groaned, and the floor beneath our feet trembled. We both stumbled backward, eyes darting around in panic, looking for an escape that no longer seemed possible. And then we heard it, a scream, a long, drawn-out scream, so shrill and piercing that it seemed to vibrate through every fiber of my being. The scream didn't come from outside. It came from inside the house. It echoed from deep within the walls, and for a moment, I swore I could feel the house itself shudder in pain. The sound twisted, contorted, as if something were fighting to break free. In that instant, everything clicked. The journal, the warnings, the things we had dismissed. The last entry, the one we hadn't read yet. I rushed to the desk, grabbing the journal with trembling hands. I flipped to the last page, desperate for answers, for something, anything, that could explain this nightmare. And there it was, scrawled hastily in faded ink. No one ever leaves. The words seemed to pulse on the page, vibrating with an energy that made my stomach lurch. I looked up, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw the figure, still pressed against the window, now smiling, a twisted, hollow smile that stretched impossibly wide. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to Sarah, but she was staring at something beyond me, her face pale with terror. She didn't speak. She didn't move, just stared. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see the figure of a man, a woman, someone, anyone, but what I saw was far worse. The hallway was empty, yet the footsteps continued, the sound growing louder, closer. Without warning, the room seemed to shrink. The walls pressed in, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The footsteps stopped at the door, and then a knock, a slow, deliberate knock, one that echoed through the entire cabin. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. It was the sound of something that had been trapped here for far too long, something that had been waiting, watching, yearning for its next victim. Sarah screamed, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the door, toward the corner of the room. I had no plan, no idea what we could do to escape. The knocking stopped. A soft chuckle filled the room, one so low, so deep, it seemed to reverberate inside our bones. It wasn't human either. The door began to creak. The handle twisted, and then it flew open with a violent force, the door slamming against the wall. For the briefest second, I saw it. The figure was standing in the doorway, but it wasn't the same one from the window. No, this one was inside. Its form was even more twisted, its body contorted in unnatural angles, its face now fully visible, a face devoid of features, save for two empty sockets where eyes should have been. It let out a low growl, the sound vibrating in my chest. I grabbed Sarah and ran. We bolted past the figure, through the door, into the hallway. But the moment we stepped into the hallway, the floor beneath us gave way. The ground cracked open, and we were falling, plunging into darkness, into the waiting void. And that's where it ends for us. No one ever leaves, not in the way you'd expect. Some places, some things don't just haunt the living, they consume them. We fell deeper and deeper into the darkness. It swallowed us whole, dragging us down through the very foundation of the cabin. And I thought for a moment that we would never stop. But then, without warning, the fall ceased. I found myself lying on cold, damp ground, gasping for air, heart racing in my chest. I could feel Sarah beside me, her breathing shallow and erratic. We had landed in some kind of underground chamber, the air thick and musty, filled with the stench of decay. I reached out, grabbing her hand, trying to pull her to her feet. But when I looked around, everything had changed. The walls were different now, slick with moisture and covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The rain had stopped. No more tapping against the windows. No more distant howling winds. It was as if the world had suddenly gone silent. The atmosphere had shifted. Something had changed, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I looked at Sarah, and her eyes were wide with terror, but I couldn't look away from the silence around us. Something was wrong. Too wrong. Narrator pauses, voice tense and slow, drawing out the tension. Then it hit me. The walls weren't just damp. They were alive. The floor beneath us creaked in an unnatural rhythm, like breathing, and the faintest murmur of whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, just out of reach. It was as though we were in the belly of the house. The walls had to have been made from the same twisted wood as the cabin above. But there was no escape. We weren't in control anymore. The cabin itself, it was alive. The very thing that had trapped us here had come from the house. It wasn't just a spirit. It wasn't just the ghosts of the past victims haunting us. The house itself had been waiting, feeding on anyone foolish enough to come near. I looked at Sarah, and her face, her beautiful, terrified face, was contorted in a way I can't quite explain. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She wasn't looking at anything. Her eyes were fixed, frozen on a point just above my shoulder. When I turned, I saw it. The figure, once outside, was now in the chamber with us, standing just behind Sarah, inches from her face. Its body had taken on a grotesque form, twisted and malformed, but still holding that same vacant stare. It stepped forward as if on command, and Sarah, my Sarah, didn't move. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Her lips parted, and I thought for a second she might speak, might say something, but nothing came out. I tried to grab her, to pull her away, but my hands went right through her. She was fading, slowly, like a shadow in the night. No, I thought, not like this, not her. But then I felt it, something tugging at the very fibers of my soul, pulling me closer to the figure, to the darkness. I wasn't sure if it was the house or something else, but I was losing myself. My vision blurred, my limbs grew heavy. I wanted to scream, to fight, but the more I struggled, the closer the figure drew to me, until the world around me went dark once again. The next morning, hikers passed by the cabin. They had been out for a stroll through the woods, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded there just hours before. They noticed something strange, though. The cabin looked empty. The door was wide open, and the rain had left only the faintest traces on the porch. But when they ventured inside, the only thing they found was an old journal, left open on the desk. The final entry was new. It read, "They didn't make it." The hikers didn't know what to make of it. No one could. What happened to us? What happened to the couple? No one will ever know, because the cabin still waits, hidden away in those deep woods, its hunger never sated. In the journal, it will keep recording. It always records. So, if you're ever out in those woods, and you find yourself drawn to an old cabin on a rainy night, remember this story. Because some places, some things, they don't let you leave. And as for the journal, it's waiting for the next entry. Waiting for you. What do you think happened to the us? Were we victims of the house itself? Or something far worse? Or is there something more sinister lurking, waiting for its next victim? I want to hear your thoughts. Share your theories in the comments below. I'll be reading, waiting for your answers. And if you found yourself hooked by this story, if the shadows of the night still whisper in your mind, then make sure to subscribe. And before you go, don't stay in the rain too long. They're still waiting for you.